Welcome to Twice 5 Miles Radio, fertile ground for conversations worth listening to and remembering. I'm your host, James Navé, always airing first on WPVM-LP Asheville 103.7, streaming online, WPVMFM.org. The voice of Asheville heard all over the world, and on other community radio stations like KCEI, Cultural Energy Radio out of Taos, New Mexico. Thank you, Walter Parks, for our theme song, walterparks.com. For more on Walter's music, Davine Dial, thank you for managing WPVM-FM. I really appreciate that. And Robin Collier, thank you for holding down the fort in Taos with KCEI-FM. Most grateful for your work as well. And if you'd like to reach out to me, Navé at jamesnavé.com, Navé spelled N-A-V-E. I would love to hear from you and would like to remind you we're sponsored by the Imaginative Storm Writing Project. If you'd like to improve your writing, imaginativestorm.com is a great place to look. Today, I have a friend on whom I've known for many, many, many years. Her name is Sally Johnstone. And Sally is an educator. She's a broadcaster. She's a producer. She's a writer, a thinker. She's done much, much work in the creative realms. And I met Sally years ago when my good friend Bob Falls and I would take little trips on Saturday night out to Cherokee, North Carolina, to a pageant, a play called Unto These Hills. And you can still go out to Cherokee any Saturday night and view the Unto These Hills pageant. It's an open-air theater experience. Lots and lots of people gather around. I don't know how many people are in the audience, maybe 1,000, who knows. It's a really big show, and it's really worth attending. And after the show, all the actors get out of their costumes, and they go back to their little community village, which is on the hill behind the theater. And there they do another kind of theater that starts at 1 a.m. And that's what Bob and I would always go to Unto These Hills for. And that's where I met Sally. So Sally Johnstone, welcome to Twice 5 Miles Radio.
Well, thank you, James. It's very nice to be asked to join you on this. Let me reminisce a little bit about Cherokee, particularly for people who have no idea what it is. I spent 4+ summers participating in the Unto These Hills production, and as you mentioned, the Saturday night shows, which were sometimes new scripts, but they were fully staged plays that were done by directors and actors for directors and actors. This wasn't open to the public, but it was open to friends, which is how you and Bob were invited. And it was some of the best theater I've ever seen. At Cherokee and Unto These Hills, it was really a magical environment. It was first described to me when I was asked to come work there as a summer camp for adults. And as it turned out, it was. We all worked hard, and we all played pretty hard. In the beginning of the summer, there were morning to night rehearsals for the big show, Unto These Hills. And that went on for about 3 weeks. Then we settled into doing those shows 6 nights a week. And on the side, did what we called the Canteen shows. So that was in between, sometimes during the day, sometimes after the show. At Cherokee, I did have a very small role in one of the scenes that was kind of fun, but my primary job was the director of sound, which meant that in addition to running the show with a colleague each night, I also worked on the repairs and the updates during the day. And the reason I mention that is that it gave me a chance to get to know several of the local folks who worked on the theater itself. It's a big outdoor theater, and people from the community tend to be hired as the staff to fix it, maintain it, make sure everything works. But I got to hear lots of great stories. And there was one, a friend, had told me that he served as an extra in a film that was being shot in the area. It was either the late 50s or early 60s, I'm not sure, and I think it was a Davy Crockett movie. But the Cherokee guys would show up each day, and even though they were all full-blood Cherokee, they had to be spray painted to a color that the showrunners considered the right look for Native Americans. He laughed about that a lot, and I joined in. It was kind of incomprehensible, but movie magic. Another story about Cherokee that's kind of fun for me is that while I was there in the summers, I spent my winters as a doctoral student at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Our program within the department there contributed most of the grad students who taught Introduction to Psychology, which everybody at some point in their college career usually takes. Now, one year, the faculty supervisor was taking a sabbatical. I was asked to manage the other grad students teaching that year. And they couldn't really pay me for that, so they paid me over the summer and let me put some things together while I was working out in Cherokee. Now, at that time, and this would have been in the late 70s, early 1980s, they had a lot of little things for tourists to do, so particularly kids. One of those activities, there were a series of vending machines that were about the same size as a person. But when you put a quarter in, you could watch, for instance, a chicken dance. I don't think this was ever much fun for the chicken because it seemed kind of warm in the sun, but it was an excellent example of operant conditioning. That's the old B.F. Skinner classic work on learning that was always part of an intro psych course. So that particular summer, I got to create a slideshow with music, of course, that showed students what the chickens had learned to do. And it was essentially when a chime sounded, which meant the quarter was inserted, they would step onto a slow-moving turntable that had chicken food on it. And for about 30 seconds, the chicken would dance on the turntable for the people watching. It was very entertaining, but I'm glad to say those arcade machines aren't around anymore. However, we used those slide shows for years for the undergraduates in our classes. So there's lots of other Cherokee stories, but those are a few that come to mind that I thought you might enjoy.
I remember when Bob and I went out to the Saturday night canteen shows. That was my first serious introduction to theater at a high level. And Bob and I at the time were working on our project called Poetry Alive, and we were brand new to the idea of standing on a stage and performing anything. And we were busy memorizing poems and trying to perform them. And then when I came to the canteen shows and saw the deep work that people did to bring those characters to life in the middle of the night, and we knew that you all were working constantly throughout the week, and that the Unto These Hills show that you did in the evening was just part of a much bigger proposition, a complete full tilt workshop. I didn't take any classes from anybody, but I do remember lapping up everything that was happening on the stage. And then afterwards, we would go out and have these little parties that lasted till dawn. Nobody went to bed, and talk about it. So I know that there were a lot of people there who went on to do things in the theater world, in the movie world. So talk a little bit more about the workshop aspect of that acting scene during that time and how it informed people and also formed them.
Well, I think you've characterized that very well, in that there was a chance to try things. You didn't have to go through getting hired by a production company. You were there, and people knew you and they knew your skills. So you'd be invited to play a certain role, whether it was on the stage or behind the stage. And we did create some fabulous sets, but everything was done for fun. And I think that is one of the most important things about that whole experience for the people that were involved in it. Nobody was trying to make money on it. Nobody was trying to go out and market to an audience. It was done for your actor and director friends. And you can't have more loving, but also critical feedback in any other kind of setting. And you're right, a number of those people went on to be successful in other media. We had a chance, Steve and I, you mentioned my husband, when I retired in January of 2023, we took a long trip and had a chance to go to see some of these people that we've stayed in touch with through emails and letters and whatnot for decades. But nobody lives in a place you normally go to visit, or at least we wouldn't normally go to visit. So we made this trek to see old friends. It was really a wonderful experience to get a perspective on that moment in your life. You know, there's some other stories I'd like to share with you that aren't directly applicable to Cherokee. After my multiple summers at Cherokee, finished my doctorate, decided that it was a lot more fun to write your own scripts when you're going to be in front of an audience than it was to become a character that someone else had invented. That's what I did. And in my career that started back while I was in grad school and participating in the Unto These Hills activities, I've had a chance to serve in leadership roles in policy organizations for higher education at both national and state levels, higher ed membership groups, public universities, private universities, and I had the unique opportunity to actually get to design both a national university and a statewide community college. How many people in their lives get to have the challenge from, in this case, it was a series of governors in the western states, and in the case of the community college, it was really the governor in California at the time, Jerry Brown, to challenge you to basically say, we need a new way of helping people achieve their living goals. So in the case of the university, the governors were very concerned that there weren't enough teachers, things cost too much. And in the case in California, the issue was that Governor Brown realized that there would be millions of Californians put out of work because of automation. And this was even before AI was a big thing, but he knew it was coming. So we designed a college that was to help people who had never been involved in post-secondary education and make it so they had the support and the capabilities and the cost levels to be able to get into new fields of study. It was an incredibly exciting experience. The university that I got to help design now enrolls over 140,000 full-time students, and it's had 300,000 grads. That's in 25 years, but it's low cost and heavily focused on direct support to students. And we did the same thing with Calbright College in California, in essence. That is, start with the students and figure out how you design and develop learning environments that will help them be successful. Calbright, which came into being about 4 or 5 years ago, just achieved their accreditation, which is a very big deal. Talk about writing your own scripts. I've also had the chance to testify in both state and federal congressional or legislative hearings. And the first time was about 30 years ago or so, and it was frankly very scary. You show up at the Senate office building and you go to the room that you've been invited to go to, and there's a big audience section and there's senators and congressmen, because it was a joint committee, sitting up on the dais. I think people have probably seen these things on television. But when you go in, it's not clear what you're supposed to do. You sort of show up, you're nervous anyway. This is big time stuff, and you've got your cool little suit on, but there's a very real protocol. I was not wise enough the first time I did this to ask my friends how it all worked, because I knew a lot of people who had done this before, but it never occurred to me to ask the nitty-gritty, how does this actually work? You sit in the audience, and what happens is your nameplate is put on the witness table. And when that shows up, you have to go very quickly and sit down in front of your nameplate, because you're going to be asked questions immediately. So don't hesitate. Just jump up there and do it, which of course I did. But I was terrified, absolutely terrified. I was probably a lousy witness, but hey, you learn. And I still do work with legislators in various states. In fact, Monday of this week, I was in a work group of legislators that are trying to sort out some conflicts in Maryland between their traditionally white institutions and their historically Black colleges and universities.
When you were asked to organize these bigger operations, and you did, and they were very successful, and that was your focus, that was your job, that was what you enjoyed, how did you know how to go about doing that? Is that something you learned in school? Is that something you were able to bring your instinct, intuition to? And how did you ask people to help you make something that big happen?
Each of these activities took years, lots of teams of people. When you can articulate the real goals of what you're trying to achieve, and again, in both of the cases of organizing institutions of higher education, the goals were very clearly to help individuals who would otherwise not have the opportunity to, let's say, make a living wage or be able to move from where they are in a social structure into a higher socioeconomic environment, being able to support their families and have at least somewhat meaningful work to do. And that was the case in both of these entities. And when you start from that premise, it's not hard to talk people into helping you with it. It also helps if you can pay them a little bit, which we were able to do. Not a lot. Nobody got rich on any of this, nor will they ever. But it's the right thing to do. And that's been really a hallmark of the work I've done in the last 40, 50 years. One of the other things that I've been able to do, thanks to my work activities, is spend time on every continent in the world, except Antarctica. As I think about what are profound little moments in my experiences, this is one. I was in China for a conference in Xi'an, and that's where the Terracotta Army was discovered in the 1970s. And I was there. It was a very short trip. And I was heartbroken that I wasn't going to get to go see the excavations or the museum that was developing. My host, a very, very kind Chinese gentleman, arranged for me and the other American that was with me in this conference to skip lunch, big formal lunch. We were able to go see the museum and the excavated site of all the terracotta soldiers, and it was truly amazing. During that same period of time, actually it was 10 days later, I was in Paris for a UNESCO meeting, and UNESCO is United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. And as I would typically do, I went a day early because it's an 8-hour time change. And you can imagine you're 8 hours off schedule and you go sit in a room with a lot of people and it's stuffy and you can get water if you're lucky. And it's really hard to stay awake. So I went over a day early. And on that day, I decided I'd go visit Notre Dame, the cathedral. This was before it burned down. And I had visited it many times before, but my memory of the terracotta army that was built, and actually it was built about 250 BCE, but it was fresh in my mind. Here I am in Notre Dame, And as I reflected on these two sites, it really struck me that the level of human endeavor was very similar. The Terracotta Army is huge. And if you've read anything about it, no two soldiers are alike. The figures themselves are larger than life size. And in the Terracotta Army Museum, where you can go see these guys, it's explained that this whole project was designed to protect one person, the emperor who had united a lot of China, in the afterlife. And then it was hidden from the world. It was buried. It was part of the afterlife tradition that you needed protection, I guess, in China. And then here I am in Europe. If you've ever walked into a cathedral in Europe, it takes the top of your head off. There's colored windows that are letting light in from way up in the heavens and artwork everywhere. That culture built these cathedrals many centuries later as an inspiration for the whole community, not to bury and protect one person. I have no idea what that really means, but I thought it was a really interesting reflection and may offer some naive insight into some of the differences in the sensibilities between the European culture, let's say, and China.
The hidden aspect of the terracotta soldiers, and then comparing that to the open celebration in the cathedral. I've been to Notre Dame many times myself. I was there 2 days after the thing caught fire. It was still smoking, and I was wandering around trying to look at it and breathing the smoke, et cetera, et cetera. And I think they're moving along with the repairs now, and maybe soon it will be open again. But I am thinking about the idea of the invisibility, like hiding things, protecting one person, and then the other idea of let's open up the ceiling and make things available to everybody, which brings my mind back to what you said about the educational system that you opened in California that was easy to get into, or is easy to get into. Anybody can go. It's affordable, and it allows people to get an education while at the same time engaging in educating themselves as well. So there's your openness. Comparing that to in America now, and maybe in other parts of the world, education in lots of arenas it's being closed down.
Yeah.
We're going to put walls up. We're going to protect you from yourself. I'm going to protect you from your brain, from your intellect, from your creativity. You need me to stop you from being you. Whereas what you're talking about is, hey, come, be you, sign up, and off we go. There's this critical tension that's going on between the openness and the hidden. And I'm thinking of the soldiers guarding the emperor who's already dead off into the other world.
Yeah.
In a similar way as some of the people that are trying to implement these educational restrictions as little emperors who feel like they need the army around them to protect them at the expense of you, me, your children, the young people, everybody.
Yeah, I think your observation there is very prescient, not as broad as just a European and or Oriental kind of orientation, but rather when we talk about, for instance, banning books, scares me a lot. It really does. You and I are of an age that we read the George Orwell books, particularly 1984, when we were in school, in high school. And it was unthinkable that a society would create an environment in which they bent the truth and didn't allow people to read what they did. We thought, oh my goodness, this is the Third Reich in Germany, which I think is part of what that was written about, where you ban books and you burn books. And we're seeing that happen. And again, I think it's very, very scary. Another example around that is some of the work I did with UNESCO for many years was around the concept of open educational resources. And the idea around that was very much that this is information that is readily available. And as colleges and universities begin to digitize what they do, why should that not be available to everyone? And I'm pleased to say that work began in the early 2000s. And now we have situations where a lot of the philanthropic organizations in the US will require that any products of work that are developed with their funding become open education resources. They are not locked behind a wall. That is true also for the National Science Foundation in our government. If you are producing materials with grant funding from the feds, it becomes an open resource for the rest of the world to be able to work with. That's a disturbing concept in some places, that anybody can get anything, anytime, anywhere. And unfortunately, we're seeing that happen in some of our states now in the US. But it is not uncommon for it to have been a problem in a variety of countries around the world, blocking access to open information. You want one more example from UNESCO? Another story. In the mid to late 2000s, I had the opportunity to basically co-write the recommendations that were coming out of the World Conference on Higher Education. And that meant you're in meetings all day, and then at night, the delegates from the regions of the world, 2 delegates from each region, come together and we hash out the recommendations that would come out of the meetings during the day. I, of course, brought my American sharing and open everything approach to this. And I was there as a private individual because at the time, the US was not a member of UNESCO. These delegate sessions, which included folks from Africa, the Middle East, South America, Asia, and then North America and Europe are one group, the developed world. But we had observers from the US State Department who had nothing to do with what I was doing, but they were there sitting at the table, just taking notes. And one of them was a woman I knew. And as we worked through these recommendations, one of the things that, of course, I valued and the European delegations valued, and we even had a group of students represented, was the notion of including students in decisions that are made about higher education. One tenet of the report that we put forward as a good practice was including students in university governance. And as soon as we started discussing that, one delegate stood up from one sector and said, basically, if that stays, our entire region, all of the delegates will walk out. We will bring other groups with us, and you will never be able to pass these recommendations. Forget it. Well, I was running the meeting, so being a good impartial meeting runner, I was shocked. Whoa. And I sort of said, okay, we'll take that into consideration and we'll discuss this in other kinds of ways, but it won't be a direct recommendation. So we had a little coffee break, and this is like at midnight or 1 a.m. This goes back to the stamina I developed in Cherokee. But we took a little coffee break, and one of the State Department people came up to me very quietly. You know, we're eating our cookie and drinking our little tiny bit of coffee, and said, "Sally, do you know what that was all about?" And I said, "No, I have no clue." So my State Department colleague said, "Well, as it turns out, students stormed the major university in that country that was represented by the delegate about 10 years ago. And it's not that they just stormed it, but they were so unhappy with some of the decisions that had been made by the administration that they killed the president and the top administrators of the university. And I kind of went, oh, well, I get it. I get it. So that was a huge lesson for me. There's things going on that you really have to listen to with your heart in a situation that you're trying to guide, something that big and complex. And I have to say that we came out of that meeting with a unanimous resolution, which doesn't quite have the level of a treaty, but it's a step down from a treaty, to adopt all of the recommendations, which did include some language around open educational resources, which I was very proud of, but it didn't say anything about student involvement and governance.
So you had to take the student involvement out, and you understood better why that needed to happen in these negotiations that were obviously delicate.
I had no idea anybody would not want that to happen.
I'd like for you to reflect a bit on why do you think people are so threatened? This delegation that pushed back, once I heard the story, I understood how they might get charged because people died. It was a small war. That happens often in the world. Aside from that, though, when I look at the way a lot of the educational systems in this country are tightening up, pushing back, banning the books, somebody is afraid of something. I can't quite put my finger on what that is that they're afraid of. What do you think it is?
I wish it were simple, because then you could go after a cause and try to undo whatever was a problem. I don't think it is simple. You mentioned my husband, Steve. He, by training, is a historian and taught classes in history for many, many years. His point is that we are in a moment of change. Things are changing. I have lived a life in which I try very hard to embrace change, to guide the change in a way, at least my single perspective might work best for the largest number of people. Change is scary, and it's very scary to people who think that some aspect of themselves is special. And as they learn that maybe it's not so special after all. Have you seen the Barbie movie?
I haven't seen the Barbie movie yet. It's on my list to see.
I went with not knowing quite what to expect, and I have to say it wasn't what I expected. But there are bits in there that talk about the privilege of white males, for instance, the discovery of that privilege and how it may not be as simple as it seems. But that's a good example. So when you see it, you can think about that. It'll hit you in the face. It's not subtle, but it's exceedingly humorous. And when I talk to my daughter about this, who's a lot younger, she and her friends found it disturbing. I found it hysterical. I mean, I laughed out loud. And she said some of her friends' grandmothers have that same response, that they laugh at it. When we went to see it recently, we were kind of reflecting on that. And she said, you've had a different experience than I have in growing up. You've transcended those issues that are still there. And she said, I get hit with them all the time.
Have you really transcended those issues, Sally? You have been in powerful leadership roles. You must have been surrounded by people that embraced you and also people that responded in the opposite way.
You can't choose always what's around you, but you can choose how you react to it. I remember at a meeting one time, some big mucky muck from the Middle East was introduced to me as a fellow leader of whatever it was we were leading. And I, of course, put out my hand to shake it. And the guy looked at me aghast and turned to his colleague, another guy, who reached out and shook my hand. You know, I could see what was going on afterwards, and I should have known better than to put my hand out and not just nod my head. But I didn't think about it. I was treating everybody the same. But my reaction to it wasn't, I was offended. My reaction was, oh my, whatever, just move on, make it work.
Do you think that your daughter's response, you said she was disturbed or was she offended?
No, she was disturbed.
Why was she so disturbed?
Well, I wish I had better insight in that. I kept trying to figure it out. She's in her early 30s and has had to come up against, in her academic as well as her professional careers, and I say careers because she's done a number of things, of people that don't treat her as a person of worth. She's young. She's still trying to figure that out. She'll have to figure it out in her own way, but she mostly transcends it and just moves on. But she said, I see this all the time. And my reaction is, well, yeah, I know it's there, but I refuse to play the game, period, and never have.
My mother said often when she was with us, the less said, the better. And I think in some ways she was saying, don't play the game.
Yeah.
If you don't play, then you don't have a game.
That's right.
It's hard to do, Sally. That's very hard to not jump in the pool, but it's a good strategy if you can employ it.
Keep a good sense of humor about you. Otherwise, you're just an unhappy human being.
So as we coming close to the final part of our time together, I'd like to go back to Unto These Hills. And you mentioned when everybody was there working, playing in their craft, fully committed, you were able to critique each other, criticize. And if you would, as a way of finishing our conversation, I would like for you to, as an educator, someone who's had plenty of experience building all of these systems out, reflect a bit on the value of criticism and how it's best employed in creative realms, educational realms, and just in life in general.
Do I get to write a whole book on this?
Please do, but we only have a few minutes to start, so you can just write the first 2 paragraphs.
I think being able to have a community around you that you trust and they trust you, for them to be able to say, that wasn't cool. That was not the right way to do things in that situation. Look what happened as a result of it. I think that's one of the most important things in our lives. We learn that in various ways, from family settings to things in school, to our community of friends, to our chosen families, even if they're not the families we were born into. Hopefully, we have a trust that lets others help us understand if we're going awry.
The criticism coupled with care and trust becomes a tool that allows people to expand in ways that will be constructive for them versus the snarky coming at somebody trying to tear them down like some clawed monster, calling that criticism. I don't know if maybe it needs another name, because I love the idea of the trust, the caring, the love, and the criticism all being in one package. This snarling animal over here is something else.
Well, the snarling animal is basically saying, Look how important I am. I don't care about you, and you can't tell me anything. That's not what I would call at least healthy criticism. And it's not the kind of critiquing that when you mentioned what went on in those canteen shows and the work together of people who are, if not devoting their whole life, at least in that time frame, really focused on their craft and trying to develop that and be better at it. In some ways, I use that specific thing. It's gotten me through a lot of fantastic and interesting experiences in my life. But part of that craft is to continually grow and learn. And as long as I can continue to do that, then I feel like I am developing my craft. But I have to do it in environments where I can trust the people around me.
This is a great place to finish out thinking about the body, the human as an instrument that can develop as a craft. The craft of being a human includes everything that we've touched on and a million more categories. I love that idea.
But there's also, it's important to remember, not a how-to guide. No one gives you a set of directions. You have to find the directions from multiple sources and incorporate those into your worldview.
So it would be fair to say every human life is an act of improvisational work from start to finish.
Even if it's not a poem.
That's a great place to close on. Sally, do you have anything else to say?
No, you set that up very well.
So Sally Johnstone, thank you ever so much for taking the time to be with us today on Twice 5 Miles Radio. I really do appreciate it.
Well, James Navé, thank you for the invitation, and it's been a very fun opportunity to respond to your perspectives as well as share some of my most interesting stories.
Well, I appreciate it, and maybe we'll do it again sometime soon.
Could be.
So there you go. Thus ends my conversation with Sally Johnstone. And since we have about 20 minutes or so before the top of the hour, I'd like to spend that time talking about education. As you learned listening to Sally's stories, and as you now know, she's been in the education world all her career and has devoted a great deal of time and focus on making systems available for people to get an education. From a traditional point of view, education means you go through elementary, middle, high school, on to college, get your degree. Maybe you go on to graduate school. Maybe you get a PhD, teach in an academic system somewhere, like Sally did. That's an education, and that's a fine way to go about it. I enjoyed the more formal educational approach that I took. Even so, I arrived at my formal education via a fairly circuitous route, which did not include a lot of academic success in high school and at a small junior college where I actually ended up flunking out when I was 20. Actually, I really didn't flunk out as much as I finished the 2 years at Brevard Junior College, and when I finished, my grade point average was below 2.0, which was below a C, which meant I wasn't qualified to transfer to another school, so I was pretty much stuck in the water after 2 years of education. And this was 1970. The reason I came up short was because I never learned how to study. I had no idea what it was like to think. I didn't know really how to sit down and create essays. I had no concept of studying, and that's because when I was in the school system during the 50s and the 60s in the Asheville area, the Buncombe County school system, this is not necessarily a fault of the school system. This is really a fault of the era, the time frame. When I was in that school system, I didn't know what to do. And the teachers, they tried. Some of them were better than others, but they really didn't quite know how to encourage the students to rise into something that was great. In the culture during that time, we were encouraged to get through school, do what we had to, and most of the people that managed to graduate from high school, I graduated from Inca High School. Most of the people that graduated from high school went on to live perfectly good lives. I knew I wanted more. I just didn't quite know how to do it. My early education was rather sparse. For example, when I was in the 7th grade, the teacher, Mr. Ramsey, who actually taught the entire 7th grade all of the subjects, we would go into one room in Venable Elementary School, sit there the whole day. We would study science, we would study spelling, we would study English, we would study mathematics, we would study geography, and on it went until the bell rang and we went home at 3 p.m. Mr. Ramsey, during the science section, stood in front of this class that I was sitting in. I'm looking up at the fellow. He had a flat-top haircut. He was tall and very confident. I remember that about him. And he made the big proclamation. This was 1959, 10 years before I flunked out or wasn't able to go any further after Brevard College. 10 years before, 1959, he stood in front of the class and he said, "There's no way anybody can ever land on the moon." He claimed it was a scientific impossibility, a physical possibility. No one could ever do it. And he was as certain of that fact as anybody could possibly be. After all, this was a science class, and he was the teacher. I was sitting there 3 or 4 rows back, thinking, that can't be right. Maybe it's because I wanted to go to the moon myself, or maybe it's because I dreamed of other people going to the moon. I kept thinking, that can't be right. That's wrong. There's more to it than that. And I think that might be the first time in my life I actually question a teacher, question authority, if you will. No, that can't be right. He's wrong. And that felt really good. So that may have been the time when my education started. That may have been when I became curious, and that may have been when I realized, okay, it's possible for me to use my own discernment around the information that comes in my direction. Of course, I didn't know it at the time. I went on to the 8th grade, the 9th grade, managed to go through all of high school. This may surprise you to learn this. As I'm sitting here recording this, I'm looking at my report cards from the 1st grade through the 12th grade. And I have to say, it's funny. The memory has a story, and the truth of it is a very different story often. I'm looking at my report cards. I'm a writer now. I have done this podcast for 6 years. I read a lot of poetry. I do a lot of things. I went back to college, actually, to get my formal education when I was 31. And when I graduated from college in 1985, I had a 3.7 average, and then I went on to get a master's degree, an MFA in writing from Vermont College. As I'm sitting here looking at my report cards from all those years ago, my yearly average in English was a D. Yuck. My average in algebra was an F. My average in history was a D. I did well in geometry. I got a C. In chemistry, it was a D. I don't know why I was promoted from the 11th grade to the 12th grade. I was. So when I look at these reports of all those years ago, my memory of me not being well educated, me not knowing how to study, I think it may well be accurate. So I bring all this up to say that the way one goes about getting an education doesn't necessarily have to follow the prescribed route. I certainly didn't. Once I managed to get into Brevard College, and I got in on an academic probation, Lord knows, you can see just looking at these report cards, and they're in very good condition. They've been in a file. I don't even know why I actually have them. T.C. Robertson was the superintendent, and R.A. Tomberlin was the assistant superintendent when I was in the 12th grade in the Buncombe County school systems. I don't know why I still have these. But I do know that the notes the teacher sent home with the report card say that I was unruly. They say that my attention span was short. They say that I would rather read than do any of the other work. Mrs. Bizzle in the 8th grade said, Jimmy, I went by Jimmy. Jimmy needs to be more thorough in his work. He is capable of doing better. And I have a little note right above that says, I'm a good boy. My goodness, talk about aspiring to conform. So I went through this educational system, and I didn't really know what an education was. I just knew that I got through it, and that was that. So when I went to Brevard College, I had the same experience. I didn't know. And after I finished Brevard College, I just went out in the world. And somewhere in my 20s, I kept hearing Mr. Ramsey say, nobody will ever land on the moon. And I kept hearing myself say, that's wrong. And I think that sense of that's wrong was echoing the notes in my report cards. He can do better. Not better in the sense that I wanted to excel, better in the sense that my curiosity in my 20s was starting to encourage me to study, to look at things. And the main way I did it was traveling. I hitchhiked. I was curious. I wanted to see the world. I wasn't interested in sitting at a desk. I wanted an education, and I wanted the education the world could give me. And it did. It actually worked. And along the way in that education, that hands-on traveling, hands-on looking at the world, I read. I actually studied. I became more and more curious. And somewhere in my 20s, I started to think, I am a bit ashamed because I didn't live up to my aspirations. I didn't go somewhere with this. Now, going somewhere for me meant just wallowing in the educational aspects of things. So when I was 30, I decided to go back to college and get an undergraduate degree. I became an adult returning student. I went first to Mars Hill College, and then after that, I went to University of North Carolina at Asheville, UNCA. And I loved every minute of it. I was free. I could do what I wanted within the context of the structure of the courses that I took. I couldn't have been happier. And I finally, after all of those years of wandering around, doing my own personal studies, whatnot, I learned how to teach myself. I learned how to learn. And I ended up getting my degree. As I said, I graduated in 1985. Good grade point average, 3.7, nothing wrong with that. I learned how to think. I learned how to be self-starting. I learned how to deliver things on time. So my education didn't have to do with something specific that would get me a job. It had to do with just me allowing myself to track my curiosity. So I was glad to talk to Sally about education, and when she said she had put together some institutions that would allow anybody to come in and study, I was happy to hear that, because I believe we will never stop learning. We are creatures that create and creatures that learn. Humans creating, humans learning. And there's an education that always happens with that. So no matter where you are with your education, there's always right now. You can always do something that will tickle your curiosity, that will take you somewhere. And if you're thinking about going back to school, in whatever form school means to you, I encourage you to do that. You will be well rewarded for following those beats that you've always had since you were just a little child, looking forward out into the world, going forth, touching the things that the day offers. And so on that note, I'd like to say thank you for listening to Twice 5 Miles Radio, fertile ground for conversations worth listening to and remembering. I'm your host, James Navé, always airing first on WPVM LP Asheville 103.7 and streaming online WPVMFM.org, the voice of Asheville, heard all over the world, and on other community radio stations like KCEI, Cultural Energy Radio, coming out of Taos, New Mexico. Thank you, Walter Parks, for our theme song, walterparks.com, if you would like to know more about Walter's music. Thank you, Davine Dial, for managing WPVM-FM. We really appreciate it. Robin Collier, thank you for Cultural Energy Radio, coming out of Taos, New Mexico. Couldn't do it without you. If you would like to reach out to me, Navé at jamesnavé.com. Navé is spelled N-A-V-E. Navé at jamesnavé.com. I would love to hear from you. What's your story? How about your education? How did you go about learning the things that you learn? What are the things that you're learning now? I'd like to know about that. It'd be fun to have that information, and I would enjoy making a contact with you. If you by chance like to write, if you like to generate written material, this show is sponsored by the Imaginative Storm Writing Project. And if you, as I said, like to write, you can always go to imaginativestorm.com, and there you will find all kinds of resources to make your writing practice a little bit better. We also do an Imaginative Storm gathering every Saturday, a free workshop, noon Eastern Time, 10 a.m. Mountain Time. And you can find out more about that by sending me an email, navé@jamesnavé.com. And when you send the email, I'll send you the Zoom link, and you can join us on Saturday wherever you are in the world. And so on that note, thanks again for tuning in to Twice 5 Miles Radio. I really do appreciate it. I hope you do come back again and listen very soon. Till then, hey, I'll catch you on that turnaround somewhere down the line.